Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Hanna.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to welcome Miss Melissa Agnes with us today. She's a leading crisis management strategist. She's the author of Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. She is a leading authority of crisis readiness, reputation management, and brand protection. She is an advisor to some of today's leading organizations faced with risk and has worked with NATO, ministries of foreign affairs and defense, financial firms, and tech firms. You've also may have seen her working as a member for the press to describe some of the crisis as a contributing press advisor on many different national and international programs. Please help me welcome Miss Agnes.
In the summer of 2014, the staff at Emory University Hospital faced a massive challenge. Fortunately, this was a challenge they were ready for. They had trained with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Their entire staff knew the protocol. They even had this special ward specifically designed and prepared. The staff at Emory University Hospital was ready to fight Ebola. And they were honored when they learned that they would be the first American hospital to gain the opportunity to do so. So that summer, they learned that 2 American missionary doctors who had been stationed in West Africa and who had unfortunately contracted the disease would be flown to their hospital for their care. This was their honor to serve these Americans who had dedicated their lives to serving others. They knew they were ready, and they were excited to share this wonderful news with their community and with the country. Emory is very active online and engaged within their community, so this next piece came very naturally to them. They created an editorial, they published that editorial online, and they shared it on social media with the community, with the rest of the world. It's what happened next that completely blindsided Emory. Within minutes, they were receiving thousands upon thousands of Facebook messages, of emails, of tweets, all saying things like, "You are bringing the plague into our country, shame on you." They had prominent figures, world leaders, politicians, celebrities, taking to Twitter to voice their discontent with the situation, with the news, tweets that were garnering thousands upon thousands of retweets, all of which were detracting from the important message that they needed to communicate. So here Emory was, excited and honored by this news, and completely blindsided once they shared it with what felt like the entire nation coming down upon them. So I'm curious, by a show of hands, who feels confident that if this happened to be, something similar happened to be your reality tomorrow morning, where you're excited to share a mission or some news, and you're honored by this news, and the next thing you know, what feels like the entire country is coming down upon you, who feels confident that you and your entire team would know precisely what to do in order to get ahead of that narrative, regain control of it, and mitigate any repercussions on the Army's brand as a whole? Show of hands. I see 1 hand. I see 2 hands. I've got books for both of you. Come see me later. By a round of applause now, who knows that if this happened to be your reality tomorrow, that you and your team would be scrambling to do all of that to regain control of the situation? You're not alone. I ask this question or a similar question to this every single time I take to the stage, and rarely do I get the odd 1 or 2 people who raise their hands. I always receive a round of applause. We live in complex times, don't we? And I don't think that many people in this world know that better than each and every one of you. We live in times of uncertainty, and we live in a time where technology has completely transformed the landscape when it comes to brand issue and crisis management. Technology, social media as an example, has provided every single person with a platform to voice their opinions. And man, do people love to share everything that they experience as they experience it. Man, are they ever opinionated, aren't they? So much so that I recently came across this image of a sign online. It reads, "In case of fire, exit building before tweeting about it." I laughed when I came across this too, and then I realized that it's not a meme. This is actually an emergency warning sign that is hanging in the emergency stairwells of public buildings across this country. A sign that says, in the event of an emergency, get yourself to physical safety before you reach for your phone and share your experience. This is the society that we live in today. These are our times today. And while technology has presented some beautiful opportunities for engagement and community relations, controlling our own message or being the publishers of our own message, the flip side is that it also presents very real challenges when things turn negative, whether it be an issue or a crisis for the brand. And there's this expectation today that if I can communicate, you can communicate. And the longer you take to communicate with me when you're put to the test, the more I'm going to control this message and the more repercussions you're going to face. In fact, there was a recent study that looked at brand crisis. So brand crisis in this digital era, and this study said that it takes the average organization or the average brand crisis, 28% of which go internationally viral within 1 hour. 1 hour from its occurrence, internationally viral. The same study revealed that it takes the average organization 21 hours to respond. Now, this is a question for each of you, and if we can have the mics. What happens in that time gap? Pardon? Fake news, absolutely. You lose the initiative. What else? The narrative changes. So you mean behind the scenes? You're trying to establish the facts? Absolutely. You don't have all the answers within the first, oftentimes, 21 hours, right? And yet there's this demand, this expectation that you will communicate. And the reality is, with this technology and with the expectations and demands that have stemmed from this technology, the longer you take to effectively respond to a crisis, and let me say effectively respond because it's not just about any response. The longer you take to effectively respond to a brand crisis or an issue that's going viral, 3 things happen. The more control over the narrative you risk losing, or you lose, it becomes everybody else's story but yours, and that has a lasting impact. The more trust and credibility you risk losing with everybody that you have worked so hard to build relationships with, whether that's the general public, whether that's lawmakers, whether that's leaders in the countries that you're stationed. And the third is the more crisis response penalty, which is a term that I coined, I call the CRP, you risk suffering. And the CRP looks at the monetary and reputational impact of a crisis as a direct result of mismanagement. So an example of this that is from the corporate world is, you remember what happened with United Airlines about a year and a half ago when Dr. Dow was brutally dragged from his aircraft? Does anybody not remember or not know about that? Do I see a hand? So a very high level, everybody boards the flight of a United Airlines flight. 4 crew members need to deadhead to get to that location to take their flight to work. So United gets on the PA system and says, we need 4 people. We're going to randomly choose 4 people to get off this flight to give those seats to our deadheaders. Dr. Dow was amongst one of those 4 people, and he refused to get off. The situation quickly escalated. The flight attendants called in security from the airport, and it ended with video footage of Dr. Dow with crooked glasses, because they were knocked off, and a bloody face, literally being physically dragged from the aircraft. One of my crisis-ready rules is always assume there's video. How long do you think that it took for that image to go viral internationally? Instantaneously. How long do you think that it took United to respond effectively? 21 hours? I wish. 48 hours. 48 hours in this case. They put out, so this is why I say effective response. They put out 3 responses within the span of those 48 hours. One of them was to the public that said, we apologize for having inconvenienced our passengers. Not what people wanted an apology for. The second one said, we apologize for having to have reaccommodated our passengers. Again, not what people wanted an apology for. And the third communication was an internal memo that was leaked, and it counts as a communication, from Oscar Munoz himself, the CEO of United, who released a memo to his staff saying, I stand by the actions that were taken. Again, completely missed the mark, completely tone deaf, counts as a communication. Over the span of those 48 hours, United watched as their market capitalization dropped by $1.4 billion. If we look at that in the lens of a CRP, so crisis response penalty, that's a $700 million a day mistake. Let me rephrase that. That's a $700 million a day needless mistake. Because they needed to come out and communicate effectively, and once they did, their market price went back up to normal level. In addition to that, legislation was changed, so their crisis response penalty impacted the industry as a whole. And from an accountability perspective, from leadership, Oscar Munoz's employment agreement was amended where he is now not going to become the chairman of United. The crisis response penalty, the longer you take to respond effectively to an incident that is garnering unwanted attention, negative attention on your brand, which is the brand of the Army, the more trust and credibility you risk losing with those who matter most, the more control over the narrative you lose, and the more crisis response penalty you suffer. And the CRP is one of the things that is absolutely avoidable. So we live in this world of heightened expectations and increased risk. So the question becomes, how can you prepare for success? And it used to be that smart organizations would take the time to create a crisis management plan. This plan for brand crisis management, this is what we're talking about, is a document, usually about this thick. Can you guys picture it? Do you guys have one, or have you seen it? Can you picture it in your minds? It's about this thick, and it sits on a shelf somewhere. And it gives solace to leadership in thinking that in the event of a crisis that we have to face, we can just reach for that plan, open it up, follow it, and it'll guide us through to crisis management success. But the reality today is that by the time you reach for that plan, the story is already miles ahead of you. You're already playing catch up. Your stakeholders, the people who matter most to your missions and to the brand, are already demanding expectations. They start at minute 0.1. So, while the act of planning, let's not make any mistakes, remains to be an invaluable exercise, the choice to solely rely on that plan puts you at a disadvantage, puts the brand at a disadvantage, puts everybody at a disadvantage. Instead, what organizations need to strive to be achieving today is what I call implementing a crisis-ready culture. I'd like you to do me a favor and close your eyes for a minute, and I can see you. I'd like for you to picture a scenario that when you think of this scenario, your heart drops to the pit of your stomach because for one reason or another, you just know that you and your team would not be ready for this one. When you have your scenario, you can open your eyes. Now I want you to imagine that in the breaking moments of that very scenario occurring and escalating, that you have the utmost confidence in yourself and in all of your team members and counterparts to intrinsically, instinctively know precisely what's expected of you and how to meet those expectations, how to regain control of that narrative before it escalates out of control, how to own that narrative, and how to manage that incident in a way that doesn't just put it to bed, but where you come out of it with increased trust, credibility, and goodwill in the brand as a whole. That's what I mean by having a crisis-ready culture today. A crisis-ready culture means that every single member of the team is able to quickly detect a threat, to the brand. Assess its material impact on the organization. Is it an issue versus is it a crisis? Because today, issues can go viral and feel like crises and not be crises. And properly categorizing events is extremely important if you're going to respond effectively and appropriately. And then be able to intrinsically respond to an incident in a way that actually fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand. And that's what I want to do with you here today. I'm going to give you 3 things plus a very important bonus that are simple, very simple, and yet take you leaps and bounds in starting to become crisis ready. And that invincibility piece that I like to use is saying that if you have an entire team that can instinctively detect, assess, and respond to any negative event in a way that fosters, builds the trust and credibility in your brand, then you have an invincible brand that can weather anything that the world may throw at you. Would you like to know what those 4 things are? Okay. So the first one is to choose your lens. This speaks to culture. It speaks to mindset. And it is the foundation of managing and responding to any and every negative incident. So the lens through which you choose to see a negative event directly impacts the actions that you take in response to that event, which directly impacts the result that that event will have on the brand. I'm going to say it again. The lens that you choose to see a negative event directly impacts the actions that you take in response, which directly impacts the result that that event has on your brand. And this is a mindset and cultural component. And I'll give you an example to make this real. I have the very big blessing of working across many, many, many industries. And one of my clients is a municipality. And recently, they called me with what felt like a very severe crisis. They called me in panic. So I'm on the phone with them, and I said, okay, tell me what happened. They said, well, we were tasked by the mayor's office to increase tourism. So we had this brilliant idea to launch a hashtag campaign where we asked our community members to chime in and to go on social and to talk about all of the wonderful things that make our city so great so that we can encourage people to come and visit us. Guess what happened? Yeah, it went the other way. They called me saying, oh my goodness, it's garnering massive attention. What do we do? As we see it, we have 2 options. One, they suggested that they close down the campaign entirely. 2, they suggested that we only focus on the positive, so to increase that and kind of, decrease the noise and attention on the negative. And they were a little bit astounded when the first words out of my mouth were, oh my goodness, what a brilliant opportunity. What happens if you cancel the campaign or if you choose to only respond to the positive? I love that you guys are talking. What? They're going to keep, yeah, because you're avoiding it, right? You're not hearing me, I'm going to keep doing it. What else? Take away the voice of the people, which you've asked for, right? What else? I don't care about the constituents. Somebody else said something? Makes you come across as disingenuous or tone deaf. One of the things that I loved about this scenario was I said, congratulations. Government agencies and entities have the most challenging time getting engagement. The most challenging time getting engagement. You managed to do that, okay, given it's not what you wanted, but you got it. So what does that say? They're listening and they care, right? They care enough about their community to say, hey, I'm going to speak up. That takes an act of care. That takes an intention of care. What happens if you now silence that voice? All of what you said is true. You're telling them, we asked, we don't like what you have to say, we're not going to listen. We don't care. So I challenged them to change their lens. And I said, what if instead of your 2 options, we approach it differently? We do 2 things. One, You respond to everybody, and not a canned, copy-paste response. You legitimately, sincerely respond to everybody. Good, neutral, negative. And then let's go a step further. Let's accumulate the 5 most shared grievances that your community cares about, and let's do a campaign, run a campaign over the course of the next 12 months, where we will actively work to do as much as we can to rectify. And we're not just going to say, here's the 5, thank you very much, we're going to turn around, walk away, and come back. They're engaging. So let's continue that momentum, and let's do that. Let's hold town halls. Let's do that in a way that is a community-building exercise. And they did. And as a result of that, today, they have this connection with their community, within their community, that is so very powerful. And as an indirect result, they've upped tourism. The lens through which you choose to see a negative event directly impacts the actions you take, which directly impacts the result that that event has on your brand. So my question to each of you is, what's the lens? What's the lens that you choose? The Army as a whole has always chosen to see people. So that's a wonderful baseline. How do you lead with that lens? And in this case, it's not about asking the question of, in this scenario, what would we do? But it's about, history tells the truth. It's about going back and saying, in these situations, what did we do? How do we lead with the right lens, and how do we reward for the right lens? And how does that impact us? Choose your lens. It's powerful. The second thing is to map your stakeholders. This one kind of seems common sense. Actually, all of this is common sense. But I rarely come across an organization that has a consolidated list of each and every single one of their stakeholders, stakeholder groups. Every department knows who they own the relationship with, but rarely does leadership have that consolidated list. And yet that consolidated list, when I talked earlier about timeline of response and expectations and demands, the answers to what is expected of you in the midst of a brand crisis or issue lies in that stakeholder list. So if you take the time to create that list, and then you go to it and you say, what is our relationship? How do we foster trust with this relationship? How do we lead with the right lens? And if something were to go wrong, or we were scrutinized, or controversy were to ensue, or misinformation or disinformation comes up, what do they expect of us? And how can we be in a position today to instinctively meet those expectations? It all starts with mapping your stakeholders and asking yourselves the right questions as to who they are and what they expect. I'll bring this back around full circle after, but this one is incredibly important. The third one is to properly categorize incidents. So I talked earlier about the difference between an issue and a crisis, and that the line is blurred today. Issues can go viral and not amount to brand crisis, and yet issues that go viral can feel overwhelmingly catastrophic, because that's a lot of noise. So taking the time now, and we'll do it together now, to define an issue versus a crisis for your brand, and a crisis for one is not necessarily a crisis for another, is extremely powerful as a baseline exercise to do. So what we're going to do is I am going to give you the definitions, and then we're going to play a little bit of a game. I'm going to give you some scenarios, taking you completely outside of the Army, and we're going to look at scenarios that are unrelated to government, and play a game as to, is it an issue versus is it a crisis, and why? Yes? Okay, so the definition of a crisis, a brand crisis. A crisis is a negative event or situation that stops business as usual to some extent because it requires immediate escalation straight to the top of leadership. Why? Because it requires their guidance, their eyes, their decision-making, their directives. Because this incident threatens long-term material impact on one to all of the following 5 things. People, the environment, operations, reputation, and/or bottom line. So a negative event or situation that stops business as usual because it requires escalation to leadership, needs their action, because it threatens long-term material impact on people, the environment, operations, your reputation, and/or your bottom line. Whereas an issue is also a negative event or situation that doesn't stop business as usual. An issue, I see issue management as business as usual on hyperdrive. It is your job description. It's a part of your job description. It's unpleasant, but it doesn't require escalation straight to the top of leadership. Leadership does not need to be taken out of their busy day to have their eyes and hands on the situation. Why? Because it doesn't threaten long-term material impact on any one of these 5 things. That's a little bit abstract, right? Just a little bit. So let's play a game. I'm going to give you a scenario, and then we're going to say issue or crisis, and we're going to talk about why. So the first scenario is the incident that happened at the Oscars 2 years ago. Do you guys remember this? So the coveted award, the coveted prize at the Oscars is Best Picture. It's the last prize of the show. La La Land was named the winner of this prize. So everybody from La La Land walks up onto the stage. They're all surrounding the microphone. There are 3 acceptance speeches in when somebody goes, oops. La La Land didn't win, Moonlight won. And then this whole embarrassing thing happened where La La Land kind of didn't know what to do, and Moonlight was sitting over there, and they didn't know if they should get up or stay seated, or was this a joke? And the announcers were very embarrassed, didn't know what they should do. And of course, all of this is captured live on television and instantaneously goes viral. And for days, everybody is talking about the crisis at the Oscars. So my question to you is, was this an issue or a crisis for the Oscars? Who says issue? Who says crisis? There are some hands. So let's start with crisis. How come? Yep. Okay, so you're skipping one step ahead of me, which is wonderful. We're gonna look at just the Oscars. No, that's okay. Do you change for the Academy Awards, do you still say crisis, or do you change it to issue? Issue? So anybody say crisis? There were other hands. Did everybody change their mind? Okay, so let's look at this. Kind of walk through the definition, right? So did it stop business as usual? It was the last award, but let's pretend it wasn't. Let's pretend it was the second award. Would it have stopped business as usual? The show would have gone on, right? Did it require leadership to come down from wherever they were to come and directly manage the incident themselves? No, it was more about business as usual on hyperdrive, yes? Did it threaten long-term material impact on people, the environment, operations, reputation, and/or bottom line? You sound less sure, yeah. So talk to me about why you sound less sure. Go ahead. You can argue for the reputation. Did you say something else? Of the Oscars. Okay, thank you. Anybody else say that? Go ahead. Absolutely. So here's the beautiful thing about issue management. So that comment, if anybody didn't hear, is improperly managed issues become crises. Not always, but here's what they do. You have 2 options in front of you. So this goes back to choosing your lens. In any issue that isn't a crisis, there's 2 options. You can be risk averse and know that it's not a crisis, so kind of sit by the wayside and let it unfold or just not do much about it. And what that does, choosing that lens, what that does is over time it chips away at the trust and credibility of the brand over time. Or you can choose the right lens and manage it proactively in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand, which does this beautiful thing for crisis management, which gives you the benefit of the doubt at the onset of a crisis because you have a proven track record of always doing what's right, even when it was more difficult, and even potentially going above and beyond. So absolutely. Anybody else say any one of these 5 things could have potentially been impacted? So I get it often, the reputation part. And absolutely, right? The fear is that people are going to be scared next year, potentially, to get up because they don't want to be made a fool, right? That's embarrassing what happened to La La Land. Nobody wants to be them, or the announcers that made that mistake or that it happened to. However, they have such a great track record that this little incident would not have threatened that long-term material impact on the reputation. And it's worth noting, because when something goes viral, that's a common, in this case in particular, it's a common thread that I get every time that I play this game with an audience. So it's worth noting, and it's worth kind of analyzing what really that long-term material impact could be and the weight of it. Compare and contrast, what would be a crisis for the Oscars? That speaks to cultural crisis. Oscars so white, absolutely. I mean, that's because of their track record. It was an issue that wasn't managed, and then it now started to be taken seriously. But that can lead to a cultural crisis had they continued to mismanage that incident. So great. A terrorist attack, right, that threatens the lives and safety of those in the building would be a crisis for the Oscars. So issue or crisis for the Oscars? Viral issue, because it went viral, but issue nonetheless. Same moment in time, PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. At this point in time, 2 years ago, PwC had an 83-year relationship with the Oscars. For 83 years, they had the honor of counting the ballots, finding out, determining who wins every award, putting those names into the envelopes, putting those envelopes into the briefcase, holding onto those briefcases for dear life, and handing off the envelopes to the announcers as they walked on stage. PwC handed off the wrong envelope. Issue or crisis for PwC? Who says issue? See a hand? Who says crisis? Let's start with issue. Why? Shows a flaw in their operations. So why issue? Because it's not a big deal? Yep. So crisis then? Yes, okay. Anybody say issue? Yes. You don't see it as a crisis because of longstanding reputation. I'm just going to repeat for everybody. Longstanding reputation, this doesn't trump that. Say that again, who got fired? If the Oscars fired them. But was it a risk? Was it a risk that they would get fired? Yes. Pardon? As a crisis. Okay. Who says crisis? Majority of the room said crisis. Who wants to share why?
I'll say it's really because it hit all 5 marks that you spoke about. If we take a look at how their, really overall, how their bottom line could really be affected by just this one issue, and also overall, could they lose a potential client that, honestly, they really don't want to lose. Overall, yes, I do think it's right.
Anybody else want to add to that? Thank you. Thank you.
If you can't get the Oscars right, what can you get right in terms of auditing a large organization, just their fiscal responsibility? If you can't hand off the right envelope at the Oscars, how can you be a trusted auditing agency for any major organization?
How can we try, and they're an accounting firm, right? So
Right.
how can we, if
Literally
we
their
can't
job.
trust you, to hand off an envelope, how can we trust you with our money? Doubt is planted, yes? So let's go through the motions. Let's go through the definition again. The incident happens. Did it stop business as usual? How I like to picture it is I picture leadership at home that evening on their couch with their family, sipping their wine, eating their popcorn, and then this happens. Do you think that they continued to sip that wine? Do you think that they shot up and started making some calls? Absolutely. Business as usual stopped. Do you think that the next day in their offices that they were taking on the regular day-to-day meetings? No. Leadership was stopping to manage the relationship that they cared about and to manage the perception that this risked seeding on the bigger brand, on the bigger picture of the brand. Stopped business as usual required immediate escalation to leadership because it threatened long-term material impact on people, so their relationships, and on their reputation, and ultimately that could have translated into their bottom line. We have the same precise moment in time was a viral issue for one organization and a crisis for another. Now, fortunately for PwC, and fortunately for PwC because they offer crisis management services, so this is wonderful, that they were instinctively ready to manage that incident in a way that took a crisis-level incident, de-escalated it down to an issue immediately, and then de-escalated that down from there to non-issue. And that is the power of being crisis-ready. Being able to instinctively classify an incident enables you to respond effectively so that you suffer the least amount of CRP. And then when it comes to brand issue and crisis, every single entity, the Army including, there are a series of high-risk, most likely high-impact scenarios. I call them high-risk scenarios. So most likely high-impact issues and most likely high-impact crises. What are yours? And if you take that list and then you compare and contrast that to your stakeholder list, you're then in this beautiful position to say, in scenario number 1, what would stakeholder group A expect of us? What would be their key concerns? What questions could we start to answer now so that when they expect us to have answers, we're starting with a leg up? We're starting with a head start to regain control of that narrative. It's simple exercises that are so profoundly powerful towards becoming intrinsically crisis ready, having that culture of instinctive reflex for crisis readiness. Properly classify incidents. So we had choose your lens, we had map your stakeholders, and we have properly classify incidents. The fourth thing that I want to share with you is so essential, and that is to get ahead of emotion. Scary picture, right? Is to get ahead of emotion. So one of the things that I love, so one thing about me is that I always ask why. Why is my favorite word. Why? I ask why until there is no more why left. And if we ask why do things escalate, why do things go viral, why do we lose control, we can answer those questions. And one of the common denominators where it doesn't matter where you're located in this world or where you're stationed in this world, the common denominator is human beings. That's why I get to work in so many industries, is because successful business is built on relationships. Crisis management is about managing those relationships when it matters most. So there's two things here that I want to share with you that goes to getting ahead of emotion. The first is, how do you detect when something has a high probability of going viral against the brand, so escalating? And the second is, when that happens, and better yet, before it does, how do you nip it in the bud? How do you respond in a way that enables you to regain control and not let it escalate? Or, if it has escalated, de-escalate it immediately. And I have two crisis-ready rules for this. The first is detecting high probability of virality. And virality is relative, right? So it's basically we're looking at garnering unwanted attention by the public. 3 factors exist in every piece of viral content, negative viral content. Emotion, so an emotionally compelling story, relatability, and shareability. And today, let's face it, everything is shareable. There is a shareable file format for every single thing, whether it's a headline, a picture, a video, a meme, doesn't matter. What's interesting here is that most negative events that are issues don't have the relatability piece. They're emotionally compelling and they're shareable, but it's that relatability piece that is the real trigger. So if you look at it this way and you say, if you feel something, consume a piece of content or read about a story or experience an incident, and it reaches you on an emotionally compelled level, and you know that by sharing that story, that incident, that it will relate to those that you share it with, what are you likely to do? You're likely to share it, right? At the very least. Most people in society, they're likely to share it. That's what social media is. So if you can be in a position where you detect these three things at the onset of their occurrence, you know it's highly emotionally compelling, you know it's relatable, and you know it's easy to share, then that's something that should be flagged for whether it would be a viral issue or escalate to crisis level. And I'm going to give you an example here. So in January of 2015, Boko Haram slaughtered 2,000 men, women, and children in Nigeria. This incident, this travesty, made international headlines with pictures, so talking about shareable file format, with devastating pictures. People consumed this content. They read about this horrific story. They felt an emotion, right? If they're human, they feel an emotion. They saw the pictures, and they carried on with their days. That same week, gunmen walked in to the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper place, and killed 11 people and injured 12 others. And the world stopped. 40 leaders, world leaders, stood arm in arm with millions of others around the world in one moment in time to stand up against this act of violence and this threat to our everything, from our public safety to our freedom of expression. What was the difference? Same moment in time, same week, massacre of 2,000 innocent men, women, and children, murder of 11 people, relatability. Both are emotionally compelling, right? Extremely. Both of them had shareable file format. One, we're very blessed in the first world to not be able to relate to a world, to a lifestyle where we're going to be brutally massacred. Our entire, towns, communities are going to be massacred. Whereas in the other scenario, we can absolutely relate to going into our place of work and not coming home because our life was taken from us. That relatability piece. And I want to make something very clear here. Shareable file format is not just headlines and memes and videos and images. In this case, it was a hashtag. Je suis Charlie. I am Charlie. Not you are Charlie, not they are Charlie. I am Charlie. 3 words that encapsulated what the world was feeling in that moment was the trigger that sent it going viral and stopped the world for a moment in time in solidarity. Emotional, compelling story, relatability, and a shareable file format. If you have a negative incident in front of you and you detect these 3 things, flag it. Now the next question is, how do you flagged it? Great. But being crisis ready is being able to detect, assess, and respond in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility. How do you respond to controversy, to fake news, to misinformation or disinformation, to propaganda in a way that actually resonates, enables you to be heard and de-escalate the situation, regain control of that narrative? I have a crisis-ready formula for that too. And that is, you take your logic and you wrap it in validation, relatability, and proof in that order. So one of my crisis-ready rules is you will never beat emotion with logic. And one of the frustrating things for me that I work a lot with government, and one of the common factors that I see is propaganda or disinformation circulating and government agencies and professionals say, we just have to keep hammering them with the truth. We just have to keep hammering them with the truth. And I am quoting some leaders when I say that. But hammering them with the truth won't work because it's reaching them on an emotionally relatable level. So in order for them, for people who are emotionally enthralled on a relatable topic that is against your brand, in order to get into the logical sides of their brains, when their hearts are blocking it, you have to get in through the heart first. And this allows you to do that. So when I say validate, I mean literally validate their feelings. And even when you think about it, when you're talking with a loved one, or you're arguing or disputing with a loved one, what do we want as human beings? We want to be heard, right? We want to feel heard. We want to feel validated. We want to feel like the people that we care about understand us. That speaks to the emotion. Come out with communication and proof through your actions that you hear them. They're validated. Their emotions matter. And then come in with the relatability piece where you say and show that what matters to you also matters to us. We not just understand you, but we feel you. And we're with you. And then you can come in with your proof. And this is how we've always done, or this is how we will do better, or this is the stats and the proof, and etc. Getting ahead of emotion is one of those crisis-ready secrets. Understand how to flag something when it has a high likelihood of going viral against you, even when it comes out of nowhere. And then know how to respond in a way that enables you to meet, if not supersede, that emotion and relatability being felt. Get into the hearts so that you can get into their minds. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? We have a few minutes, and I want to end with a story. But if you do have a question about that, it's important, so I want to address it. Yeah?
Could you relate that formula
to the Dr. Dow situation. So relate this formula. So what United did was they came out, they were completely tone deaf. They said, by saying we are apologize for reaccommodating and inconveniencing, and we stand by our crew, they're in no way validating the experience that Dr. Dow was subjected to, nor are they validating the experience that everybody on that, the abuse that everybody on that plane was subjected to. They completely missed the mark. And they didn't do any of this. They didn't validate, they didn't relate, they were completely tone deaf, and they didn't make any proof or submit any proof that anything was going to change. When they did, so if you go back and watch the interviews that 48 hours later, often a question I get is, United and all of these mega brands, it hits their market cap and then it goes back up, and they don't seem to have any significant long-term damage, so why does it matter? First of all, who do you want to be is my first and foremost question. Do you want to be somebody who understands people and proves that when it matters most, that you put people first? Secondly, if you look at these big brands, they don't go back to normal until they get it right. So why not get it right away? Why wait 48 hours and suffer that CRP? So let's do this. I'm going to end with a story. I'm going to bring it back to Emory, because we started with Emory. And I have a book for anybody who tells me, first person who tells me, whether the situation that I described at the start of this talk was an issue or a crisis for Emory, and why. Ooh, who says issue? Well, now I have to give away a book. Who's brave enough to? Issue? Crisis? So you loud with crisis. One person be loud with issue, and we'll debate it out. Pardon? You say issue? Okay, why crisis?
I would say crisis number one because it affects people, it affects the bottom line, because if there are serious concerns about bringing this Ebola and virus to this hospital, who's going to want to come and be infected by it? So I think it hits at least those two parts that you talked about.
Okay, so long-term material impact. Thank you. Oh, there was one more, sir, for issue. You were the loudest.
First time I've heard that. So issue. Seriously. Won't either. So versus the crisis was the Ebola aspect of it, right? So the issue is that they're taking it on at the hospital and that they can address it. So while I'm sure that it did bring in a lot of other folks, where am I going with this? Let me pause for a moment, regroup. Issue because it didn't impact their environment. It didn't necessarily impact their money, their bottom dollar, but it kept moving forward. They can get through the issue of the day and keep showing that they're. I'm stumbling. Anybody want to help?
Okay,
so thank you.
Sure, go ahead.
Phone a friend, right here.
Lifelines.
So, working on the Ebola crisis, I think what happened was, I think it's an issue because it was an isolated incident that then grew worldwide, and then it was solved somewhere else. And I think that's why it becomes an issue for that particular company, and it was short term, but the long-term effect was the virus for the world. And then it was taken, the control was taken at the world level and not just at the hospital level.
Okay, so I'm sure.
Why does it matter if it's an issue or a crisis if you analyze it as a crisis so it doesn't become one? So if you look at everything as an issue or a crisis using the same formula and the same response, it won't become a crisis because you'll manage it correctly.
I love that because that is choosing your lens. But most people don't do that, first of all, so thank you for that. And secondly, it's really important to classify. So in this case where it's issue, crisis, your point is valid, your points are valid, and it's difficult to go back in time. Right now, hindsight is 20/20. So it's easy to say it wasn't an issue or it wasn't a crisis because it didn't, do any damage, but it didn't do any damage because they managed it well, potentially, right? So it's really important. It triggers the line of response that you're going to give. It should always be emotionally relatable. You should always use that formula. But are you going to go full throttle proactive, or are you going to, contain it to a certain group of people, or are you going to sit back and monitor and let it unfold, and then figure out what the threshold is that it's going to go across, and then you're going to respond? So that's the importance of really classifying, and also to give yourself a break. When something goes viral against your organization and feels like a crisis, if you know this is an issue, not a crisis, you get the luxury of a little bit more breath, which is a really great luxury to have in that moment. So this one is challenging. You were spot on. You didn't need to go further. The crisis was Ebola. That was what needed their reputation, their funding. All of that was accounted to managing the crisis of Ebola. Now, there is a potential crisis within the crisis of Ebola, which is called Fear-Ebola, hence that picture that I showed you, that devastating picture. Fear-Ebola is a real thing. Fear-Ebola is the irrational fear of the disease. So talking about emotional relatability. So what Emory did was they chose the lens. So I spoke with Emory, and they said, we deal with crisis every day. We knew that this was an issue, a very serious issue that could have escalated, but an issue nonetheless, and they knew how to handle it. So what they did was they took moments, not a long time, because time is of the essence, right, that 21-hour gap. They took moments to go and understand their stakeholders, understand the root cause as to why were we blindsided, why is this happening? Here we are incredibly prepared. Why is the world reacting this way and shunning us as a result? The answer was twofold. Fear-Ebola stems from not knowing how Ebola is truly spread, and not knowing that Emory had spent months upon months with the CDC preparing for this exact type of event. Nobody knew that because they forgot to tell people that to an extent that counted. So now they asked the why, they understood the stakeholders, and they came out, they understood too that they couldn't just come out and say, guys, we got this handled, don't worry. Nobody was gonna listen to that. So instead, they went back to understanding the emotional relatability, and over the course of about the next week, and starting immediately, they started addressing all of the key concerns, those emotional, intrinsic key concerns, in ways that were emotionally relatable, through video, through graphics, infographics, through texts and publications, interviews, all speaking, you can go back and research it, in emotionally intelligent ways where they validated, they related, and then they showed the proof. And almost instantaneously, as quickly as it went viral against them, all of a sudden, the entire narrative changed. And they were getting an influx of messages still, but this time, words of appreciation. Thank you for dedicating your lives to helping those who serve others. Thank you for taking the time to do this, for putting your lives at risk for others. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so happy to be a part of this community. I'm so happy to be a part of your community. They chose the right lens. They understood their stakeholders at play here. They understood issue versus crisis, and therefore how to respond appropriately. They understood what triggered that, which was that emotionally compelling relatability factor. And they knew the formula for responding to that in a way that actually de-escalated, instantly de-escalated the situation. Choose your lens, map your stakeholders, categorize incidents, and get ahead of emotion. 4 extremely powerful tools for becoming crisis ready, building that culture of crisis readiness so that you're in a position to nip any negative event, any negative narrative in the bud in a way that actually fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand of the Army, one of the most important brands on this planet. My name is Melissa Agnes. I am honored to be here. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Thank you for all that you do, and I wish you continued invincibility for the good of everybody.